So my name is Kozia Ziambo, and today we are looking at Hippocratic Oath and the cross. It's a very interesting combination. So I'm looking forward to see how this is going to be like. So we have Dr. Peter Saunders, a general surgeon trained at Auckland Medical School in New Zealand, and he has served as a mission doctor in Kenya, and I served with a Christian Medical Fellowship in UK for 27 years, and now is the chief executive of the International Christian Medical and Dental Association. He is currently working, he involves leadership training, teaching evangelism and ethics, medical mission, writing, editing, and media work. He is a council member of the Evangelical Alliance, and he and his wife, Kirsty, live in St. Albans, UK, and they have 3 kids and 1 grandson. Thank you so much, Dr. Peter Saunders, for being with us today. So we just allow you to please go ahead and pick it up, and we can take a deep dive in what you have for us today.
Thanks very much, Kozia, for the warm welcome, and welcome everybody here. I hope you can hear me okay. So let me just share my screen. If successful, I hope you can all see that. Give me the thumbs up, Kozia, if you can see the screen. Okay, great. Thanks very much. So yes, as you said, this is a rather interesting subject, ethics, worldviews, and the cross. And what we're going to look at is some of the recent global ethical trends, particularly in the West, which are now impacting on all of the world. Look at worldviews and how they impact ethics. Look at the influence of secular ethics, which is on the rise. And then we're going to go back to Hippocrates, Christianity, and then finally finish with a Christ-centered approach to ethics, building on principles. Now, some of what I'm going to say is in this little booklet, which is available free in several languages on the ICMDA website, Changing Culture and Changing Values. Now, the Bible tells us about the men of Issachar who knew the times and who knew what Israel should do. And I think that's a great challenge for us in any time. Do we understand the times in which we live? And do we know what we should be doing as God's people? John Stott, who is a greatly gifted Bible teacher who's now with the Lord, used to talk about the importance of double listening, that we listen to God's word on the one hand, and we listen to the world on the other hand, and we bring them together. We've got to be double listeners who know both. And the scope of medical ethics is very broad. We're not going to cover this in great detail. I'm going to concentrate more on the first 2 issues, but the principles apply across all of these issues. And let's just think about what's happening in the world at the moment. There are 43 million abortions every year in the world, and this is leading to great demographic change. We're going to come back to that. And we now know that there are effects not just for the baby, but for the mother in terms of premature deliveries and subsequent pregnancies, mental health problems, and breast cancer as well. 43 million is a huge number when you consider that just 57 million people die from all other causes. So almost half of all the people who die in the world each year are unborn babies being killed by doctors or nurses. And the red parts of this world map are where abortion is legal on demand, and the green and blue parts, and you can see much of this is in Africa or in South America. Abortion is controlled for some reasons, but there's a huge move to impose abortion on South America and the African continent. Worldwide, Russia tightened its abortion laws a few years ago because they were worried that there were a decreasing number of young people and too many elderly people. And in China and India, we've seen that there's a huge shortage of women because of the selective abortion of female babies, which has led to all sorts of problems in terms of abuse of women and women trafficking as well, because of the imbalance between men and women. The rise of pornography, I believe, has also been promoted by this. And you can see this is the sex ratio at birth. And in these countries here, which are Vietnam, India, and China, the ratio of women to men is much higher than it is in these other areas. And that's because of the preferential abortion of female babies. We've seen the rise of artificial reproduction. This has been because of several reasons. Firstly, women, especially in the West, are delaying childbirth until they're less fertile and it's harder to get pregnant. There's a rise of sexually transmitted infections leading to tubal infertility, and a fall in the babies available for adoption because, excuse me, solo parents are keeping their babies. And so artificial reproduction now has accounted for over 8 million babies worldwide. We have a whole host of technologies, from sperm and egg donation to IVF, gift, and also now commercial surrogacy, where people in developing countries are being paid to carry babies for people in the West, often LGBT couples. Embryo research, IVF made this possible. So embryo freezing, disposal, and experimentation are now widespread practices. The biopsy of embryos, which has opened the door to such things like therapeutic and reproductive cloning. But especially what we now have the technology to identify all sorts of genetic abnormalities before birth. And so we're seeing now the age of prenatal selection, where especially babies with Down syndrome or spina bifida or cystic fibrosis are identified in the womb, either through tests like amniocentesis or on ultrasound, and aborted because they carry a disability. Theoretically, because there are 8,000 genetic diseases, this will spread more and more. And it's far easier to identify and abort a baby than it is to fix the problem. And so this is why the West has gone down this route increasingly of saying that if you're not a perfect baby, then you're in danger of losing your life. Contraception, of course, much more widely available. And there are different views among Christians on family planning. We believe the general Protestant or evangelical view is that it's fine to use contraception to space families, but some contraceptives, like the intrauterine contraceptive device, act after the time of conception. And so they actually end the life of a very early human being rather than stopping it being conceived. And reproductive health services are being increasingly pushed by multinational organizations like the IPPF and the UNFPA across Africa and Southern America. Euthanasia is now legal in the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Canada. It's just been made legal in New Zealand, my own country, and there's a lot of pressure in other places too. Assisted suicide, where the doctor helps the patient to kill themselves, is legal in several US states as well as these countries, and in Switzerland. So we're seeing more and more of a push to the legalization of euthanasia and assisted suicide. Big story in Britain this morning is another attempt to change the law led by a doctor who wants to legalize it. I talked about demographic effects, and you can see here, these are the population pyramids for the country of Japan. So this is 1950, and you can see 35% of people then were below the age of 15 and just 5% over 65. By 2007, that had risen to 21%. Children under 15 had dropped to 13%. And by 2050, we're going to have 40% of the population over 65 and only 9% under. Why is this? It's driven by abortion, smaller families, better medicine, and so on. And so we're getting dramatic demographic change. Most pyramids in Africa look like this one. Most pyramids in the West are looking increasingly like this one. And as they say, it is likely that the generation that killed its children through abortion in the West will be killed by its children through euthanasia in the Western world. So beware of these pressures coming on Africa as well. Ethical decision-making is becoming much more difficult now for a variety of reasons. Firstly, we can do much more. So advances in medical technology and knowledge mean that we have more choices, and so we have more decisions to make. There's a shift now from paternalism to patient autonomy, whereby the patient demands what they want. The influence of the mass media, social media, and the internet tells them what is available. Often by reading up on the internet, the patient may know more than the doctor that they're seeing about a rare condition, but it may have come from a very bad source. A move from solo practitioners to team management, financial and resource constraints, these are all playing a part. But the biggest reason why there's so much conflict now is because of the loss of a moral consensus among healthcare professionals, especially in the West, and this will impact in Africa as well. Now, we need to think about worldviews, because a worldview, there's an unpronounceable German word there to describe it, but it is the overall perspective from which one sees and interprets the world, or a collection of beliefs about life and the universe held by an individual or a group. And each of us has a worldview. And if you think of a worldview, it's a little bit like an iceberg. You only see the 10% which is above the water, which is the behavior, how a person lives. But the worldview, their basic beliefs, shape their beliefs about what is true, and their values, what is good and right. And these are exhibited in the behavior. If you want an African parallel, think of a hippopotamus. All of it almost is below the water, just the ears are above the water. That's all you see is the ears, which are the behaviors, but the worldview, the beliefs and the values are beneath. And cultures are driven by worldview. The word culture comes from the Latin cultus, meaning worship or cultivation. And the culture we live in cultivates us through family, education, media, law, and cultures are determined by the worldview. So cultures can be Christian, Islamic, Buddhist, Hindu, pagan, or humanist. If you like, culture is religion externalized. The way the values we hold and the behaviors we exhibit are evidence of our underlying worldview. And what we're seeing in the Western world now, and this will impact on Africa in the future and already is that we're shifting from what was a Christian worldview to a humanist worldview or an atheistic worldview. And as a result, values and beliefs and behaviors are changing as well. In any culture, it's the mountains of culture which drive its trajectory. And these are the 7 mountains of culture: education, so schools and universities; arts and entertainment, what's on television and on film and in popular media and in social media, especially now; government and the laws that it makes; family, of course; religion, we've mentioned, but also business and media as well. These are the mountains of culture. And so the beliefs that are expressed, the behaviors that are exhibited, drive the direction of the culture. Now, if you want to know somebody's worldview, then there are 6 questions you can ask to determine it. I've put a big word beside each of these: the theology question, the anthropology question, epistemology question, and so on. But these questions are actually very simple. What is God? Does God exist? Does God have thoughts? Is God personal? And so on. Are we all God? What are human beings? Are we just clever monkeys? Are we just the product of matter, chance, and time? Just dust? What is the best way to discover truth? Is it through scriptures? Is it through our intuition? Is it through observation of the world? Why do human beings have significance, if you think that they do at all? Is it because we're a highly evolved species, or is it because we're made in the image of God for a relationship with him? How do we decide what's right and wrong? Is it just what we feel internally? Is it what our conscience tells us? Is it what respected teachers tell us? Is it what leads to the preservation of the species? Or is there something beyond that? Is there a God who gives revelation about these sorts of things? And then what happens to a person at death? Does death lead to reincarnation, where we come back? Does it lead to judgment and heaven and hell? or does it lead to nothing at all? So the way you answer these questions will determine your worldview. And if we look at worldviews, we find that there are 4 major worldviews in the world, and they're affiliated to different religions. So there's pantheism, polytheism, theism, and atheism. So Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are all theistic worldviews. Naturalism, existentialism, nihilism, or atheistic worldviews. People in Africa, a lot of them, of course, are Muslim or Christian, but a lot still ascribe to a polytheistic worldview, tribal religions, animism, folk religions. Sometimes it's a mixture of the two. But our worldview determines our beliefs and our values and our behaviors. So if we look at, we can categorize on the basis of these 6 questions that we've just looked at, the 4 different categories of worldview. And so theists, Christians, Muslims, and Jews believe in a personal supreme God, that we're made in God's image, that truth is revealed by God through the scriptures, that we have value because we're created by God, and morality is in line with the nature of God, and death leads to judgment in heaven and hell. But look at, say, polytheism. Many people in Africa would still be polytheistic or animist, believe in multiple gods, that human beings are lower rational beings, lower than the gods, that truth is grounded in tradition and the ancestors, and our value is because we're at a certain place in the hierarchy of gods, and it's all about power, and in death we enter the spirit world. You see, so polytheism denies judgment, heaven and hell, and denies the existence of an overall God. But look at atheism. This is the predominant view in the West now. And the view of atheism is that God doesn't exist, that human beings are just clever monkeys, that truth is discovered through the scientific method, that, well, when it comes to questions of why human beings are valuable, or what is right or wrong morally, it is really quite arbitrary, although we'll see it follows a certain route, and that death is the end, it leads to nothing. And of course, if you believe these things, that God doesn't exist, that we're just clever monkeys, that you can more or less make up your own values and morality, and the death is the end, so there's nothing to answer to afterwards, then it will have repercussions for the way that you live your life. If we look at the whole world and we look at these 4 different worldviews, we see that by far and away the most common worldview in terms of people holding to it is theism. So Christians, Muslims particularly, but also Jews make up almost 4 billion people in the world would ascribe to one of those worldviews. Following that is atheism, mainly in China and in former Soviet Union, but particularly increasingly in the Western Europe and America, North America now. Pantheism, mainly the Indian subcontinent, and polytheism, about 800 million. So you can classify people into those different views. Now, Christianity has profoundly influenced Western culture, and through Western culture has shaped the whole of the world, and especially Africa as well, through the colonial era. And if you want to read a great book on how Christianity has shaped Western culture, then you can't do better than Vishal Mangalwadi's The Book That Made Your World, How the Bible Created the Soul of Western Civilization. I encourage you to read that. He's put another simpler one out. So then we have theism, again summarized, God's an all-powerful creator. Death leads to judgment, heaven and hell. We're made to worship God, and truth is revealed by God through the scriptures. But what we saw in the Western world over the last 2 or 3 centuries is that there was a move away from theism to atheism. And there were 3 main reasons for this. Firstly, a philosophical change called the Enlightenment in the 18th century made human reason the highest authority in the universe. So they said God doesn't exist, or we can't hear from God, and so it's human beings who have the highest authority. It takes you right back to the Garden of Eden, doesn't it? And then Charles Darwin's theory of evolution provided a basis for believing in a godless universe. It made atheism intellectually respectable because it claimed to give an explanation for biological complexity and life. And then the third thing that happened was that higher criticism, or criticism of the Bible, providing doubt about the authenticity of scripture, undermined the belief in biblical authority. And these three things together led to the West, which was thoroughly saturated with a Christian worldview, moving into an atheistic worldview. And so we saw this shift from people back in the 17th and 18th century believing that human beings were created and morality was revealed through scripture, to a doubt in scripture, so still believed in God, but didn't believe God communicated clearly with us. And then man was seen as an evolved individual, and morals were discovered through the scientific method. And then finally, an evolved species, and morals were chosen. So a denial of intelligent design, if you like. Now, you can follow in countries like Britain the way that Britain turned from Christian to atheist. And if you go back to the foundation of the Sunday school movement in 1774, which was the late 18th century, it had a profound effect in the way that the children thought and were brought up. And by the year 1860, when there was a great revival in Britain, about 70% of all children attended Sunday school. And so they were saturated in the teachings of scripture. But by the year 1900, this had fallen to 50% from 70%. And by the year 2000, it had fallen to about 3%. So now we have a whole generation which knows very, very little about Christian theology or scripture. We have a post-Christian civilization. And so you see here, this is the percentage of the child population going to Sunday school, falling from around 50% in 1900 down to around 3% in the year 2000. It's even lower now. So, and much of that change took place around the 1960s at the time of the sexual revolution. And so if you ask people in Britain now what their religion is, then you can see the black line, which is no religion at all, has risen from 30% up to around 50%. We've just answered the latest census, and people are saying it's going to be 60 or 70% in that. We'll have to wait and see. The Church of England particularly has fallen, and other Christian religions have stayed about the same, but we now live in a predominantly post-Christian culture. And this is especially true about young people. So if we look at old people 75 plus, then Church of England is still the biggest one, and very, very few atheists at all. But if we look at 18 to 24-year-olds, over 60% of them are atheists, and very, very few belong to any Christian religion at all. So you can see as time moves on, the society is going to become increasingly post-Christian. And so it's this worldview that God doesn't exist, that moral good is determined by human beings, that there's nothing after death, we're just higher animals, and we discover truth through observation. Richard Dawkins, famous evolutionist, who said on Twitter about a baby with Down syndrome, he says, abort it and try again. It would be immoral to bring it into the world if you have the choice. So that was his view. He felt that some human beings were not worthy of living, and he and other atheists like him have been very critical of Christianity. They would say we don't need God to explain biological complexity. The Bible's unreliable anyway, and the Christian God himself is immoral, claiming to judge us and destroy human beings. So he rejects Christianity, and many people follow his beliefs now. So we've gone from a Christian or Hippocratic, we'll come back to that view, where human beings are made in God's image and all human life is of infinite value, to a position where, and a belief where the strong should therefore make sacrifices to the weak, to this new kind of ethic, a secular or materialist ethic, where human beings are just seen as one of many species on the planet. The value of human life depends on its quality, and the weak should be sacrificed for the strong in order to keep this human species strong. Peter Singer is an Australian philosopher and ethicist who wrote the book Animal Liberation, and he's been very influential in shaping medical ethics. And this was an article he wrote back in 1983 called Sanctity of Life or Quality of Life, which was published in the journal Pediatrics. And you can see here he says, we can no longer base our ethics on the idea that human beings are a special form of creation made in the image of God. Once the religious mumbo jumbo surrounding the term human has been stripped away, we may continue to see normal members of our species as possessing greater qualities of rationality, self-consciousness, communication, and so on than members of any other species, but we will not regard as sacrosanct the life of every member of our species, no matter how limited its capacity for intelligent or even conscious life may be. If we can put aside the obsolete and erroneous notion of the sanctity of all human life, we can start at looking at human life as it really is, at the quality of human life that each human being has or can achieve. No, so what Peter Singer is saying is that human beings aren't equal. Some of them are more important than others. And if you're more intelligent or have greater rationality or self-consciousness, then you're of more value than other human beings who don't. And human life is not sacred. And so it won't surprise you that Peter Singer advocates abortion because fetuses can't think like adults, and advocates the destruction of people with disabilities. And so we have moved into this era of embracing what I call the secular virtues, personal peace at any price, which says, I want it, I want this. Autonomy says, I can choose it. Technology says, we can do it, we can deliver it. And relativism, moral relativism says, why not? I want it, I can choose it, we can do it. Why not? And so what we're seeing now in the West is the fruit of secularism, which particularly came in the 1960s with the sexual revolution. And these are the trends that we see all across the Western world now. Easy divorce and cohabitation, abortion on request, elimination of children with genetic abnormalities, particularly those with Down syndrome, increasing promiscuity, sexually transmitted infections, euthanasia and assisted suicide being legalized, changing demography, as I've talked about, with more and more elderly people, fewer younger people, and now gender reassignment and the erosion of Christian liberties. And people now risk losing their jobs if they express a Christian view on things like marriage or sexuality or gender or abortion, for example. If you really want to trace this well, one of the best books on the effects of the global sexual revolution is this book by Gabriel Kubi, The Global Sexual Revolution, where she traces all of its philosophical and worldview roots. And one of the best books on the transgender movement at the moment is Ryan Anderson's When Harry Became Sally. This is a brilliant book written by an American lawyer. You can no longer buy this book on Amazon. It's just been banned from Amazon because it doesn't fit with the prevailing worldview. And so we're seeing increasing degrees of censorship towards a Christian worldview. But what are the consequences we've seen? Well, again, this is the UK. You can see divorces here in the blue line rising over time from 1930 to 2012. The number of marriages is falling. And so this means that the percentage of babies born outside marriage increases. So about 5% in 1950, up to almost half, it now is half by the year 2020, are born outside marriage. So children growing up in families where there is not a mother or a father. Abortions legalized in 1967, huge increase, now around 200,000 abortions per year in Britain. And most Western countries will follow these. This is the incidence of sexually transmitted diseases. So from 2005 just to 2014, you hear, but a huge increase in gonorrhea and chlamydia in particular that we're seeing. And a reminder again of the changes in the demography that is resulting from the breakdown of marriage, the breakdown of the family, rising rates of abortion, and increasing attractiveness of euthanasia and assisted suicide. So we are observing in the West what I would call an end stage culture, a Romans 1 culture, a post-Christian culture, which is imploding and leading ultimately to, I believe what we're going to see is tyranny and collapse in the next generation or so. And then I mentioned briefly as well the rise of the transgender movement, more and more boys, but particularly girls, seeking to change their gender by having sex change hormones or surgery because they believe that they're a woman in a man's body or vice versa. And the government very close to legalizing this whole process. This is very, very controversial at the moment in Britain. Now, if we look back at ethical decision-making, we see that there were three main schools, and we haven't got time to go into these in great depth, but the consequentialist school, whereby things were judged right or wrong on the basis of the consequences of those decisions, associated with the philosopher David Hume. Secondly, the deontological school goes back to the philosopher Immanuel Kant, where right or wrong was decided on the basis of conformity to a set of rules. And then virtue-based ethics, Plato, the idea that in order to make good moral decisions, you have to be a moral agent. You need to have a moral character. So that historically have been the three different, more recent bases. But actually, medical ethics in Western culture originally goes back to two main roots: the Hippocratic Oath of 600 BC and the Judeo-Christian ethic derived from the Bible. And it's been restated in other declarations since then. Now, the Hippocratic Oath talks about lots of things, but very interestingly, it's both against euthanasia and abortion. I won't give deadly medicine to anyone. It's interesting that it's coming out of a Greek culture, a polytheistic culture, but strongly against euthanasia and abortion. And if we look at the common threads between Christianity and the Hippocratic Oath, we see that there are a number of quite common threads. So belief in God or a higher power, respect for teachers, that colleagues are brothers or sisters, that my patient comes first, you shouldn't take innocent life, you respect patients' secrets, you don't misuse your power to abuse patients financially or sexually, and you won't let the state or anyone else control you. You're driven by a higher code. And it's interesting how incredibly radical these things were at the time of Hippocrates, but also expressed even more forcefully in the Judeo-Christian ethic. And what's happened since the time of the Second World War is that medical ethics have been gradually changed. So, for example, the Declaration of Geneva, which was passed just after the Second World War, talks about maintaining the utmost respect for human life from the time of conception. That's now been changed to from its beginning, and beginning is not defined. Of course, making abortion admissible. In the same way, the International Code of Medical Ethics was passed by all the medical associations of the world in 1949 after the Second World War, preserving human life from conception, and the words from conception were removed in 1983. So the medical profession, as it got increasingly involved in abortion, had to decide, would it change its behavior, or would it change its ethics? And it decided to change its ethics rather than its behavior. And now we see, for example, the British Medical Association talks about in 1947, after the Second World War, they called euthanasia, suicide, and abortion the greatest crimes. But by the year 2000, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists was calling abortion a basic healthcare need. And this is a Jacques Attali, European politician, who says, as he goes beyond 60 to 65 years of age, man lives beyond his capacity to produce, and he costs society a lot of money. Euthanasia will become an essential instrument of our future societies. So that's the trajectory. You legalize abortion, you change your view of human beings on the basis of their mental capacity, then euthanasia becomes attractive, especially as the demography of the culture changes. So let's just, in closing, look at some Christian principles. How are we to make ethical decisions? And I'd suggest that we use these four principles. We share the mind of Christ, we hold the commands of Christ, we display the character of Christ, and finally we carry the cross of Christ. Excuse me. So what does it mean to have a Christ-like mind? Well, it means that we think from the perspective of a Christian worldview. We start with those basic beliefs. We see human beings as created in the image of God and therefore incredibly precious. But we believe that we are fallen because of sin, and that we, even though we're masterpieces, we are flawed or damaged masterpieces. And we look to science and technology as gifts of a good creator, but we also recognize the need for rebirth and regeneration, and for God's wisdom in making ethical decisions. And when we look to the future, we don't see death as the end, but we see it as a gateway to judgment and the new creation. So that's a Christ-like mind. It's being saturated with the big story of the Bible. Thomas Sydenham was a great Puritan doctor of the 17th century. In the UK, they called him the English Hippocrates. And we're almost out of time, but so I won't read this in detail, but these are, you're welcome to have these slides afterwards. And this is what he said to his students at the first day when they started medical school. It's an amazing statement of Christian theology. And what he says, in a sense, is that human beings are incredibly important because, firstly, they're made in the image of God, and secondly, because God himself became a human being in the person of Christ. And so he gave nobility to the human race. And that was the starting point to challenge, to practice medicine, that everyone before him, every human being, was made in God's image and incredibly precious. And that he bore in mind that he was a human being and that he would face judgment as well, and that he'd have to give an account to God of everyone he looked after. So a Christ-like obedience, and there are these biblical principles with which we're well familiar. So human dignity, that we're made in God's image and worthy of respect, wonder, protection, and empathy. The complementarity of the sexes, that male and female are distinct and different. They're not interchangeable. Stewardship in science, that God has given us minds to understand the world, to develop scientific theories and technologies, and that we should use those to serve our fellow human beings. So we see science as a good thing, provided we do it in accordance with God's guidance. The sanctity of human life, that we should not take innocent human life. The importance of marriage and family, one man, one woman for life, being the basis for relationship, for society, but also for the raising of children. And children are a gift given to us by God, but not our possessions to use as we might choose. Confidentiality, that you must never use private information about a person against them to their harm, but we follow the principles of justice and equity, and we never see the never believe that the end justifies the means. We believe that we must do God's work God's way, and that we believe that we should be making sacrifices for the weak, and that if we have power or knowledge or skill, then we use it to serve, not to exploit others. It's the very heart of the Christian gospel. And there's a lot in the scriptures about life before birth, references to conception, many references to life before birth, references to Jesus Christ in the first month of his womb. And then, of course, this wonderful passage in Psalm 139, talking about God creating the baby in the womb, communing or having a relationship with the baby in the womb, even before it's aware that it exists, and of the continuity of life before and after birth, so that when David the psalmist looks back, he says, in the womb, that was me, the same me that's here now. And we could, if we had more time, look at the various arguments that are brought for demeaning the status of the embryo, but I think they are all flawed. That we know that once conceived, that the only difference between a one-day embryo and you and I is nutrition and time. It's the same human being, and that the law against killing the innocent goes right back to the time of conception. So Christ-like mind, Christ-like obedience. Thirdly, Christ-like character, because in order to make the right kind of moral decisions and be imitators of God, or imitators of Christ, as we're called to be, we need to have a godly character. We need to be transformed by God to have the fruit of the Spirit of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. We need to be people of courage, people filled with God's Spirit who are shaped by him and increasingly Christ-like in the decisions we make. So it's not enough just to know what the right thing to do. you've got to have the patience, the love, the compassion, the selflessness in order to do it. Christ-like character, and then finally Christ-like cross-bearing, so that we're called to carry the cross, and this involves suffering and cost. It involves suffering to stand up for Christian values in the face of persecution, and that's increasingly an issue now in the Western world. But it also provides being willing to suffer to provide the compassionate third way. What I mean by that is that a woman with an unwanted pregnancy may feel she has only two options: to abort the baby, or to be overwhelmed by the baby she can't care for. But of course, there is a compassionate third way of support, good antenatal care, and so on. In the same way, it's not just a choice between a lethal injection or pain, but the third compassionate way is the way of good palliative care and pain relief. And so it involves suffering, and it involves cost to become the kind of doctors who can provide care to people in desperate situations, but also be willing to stand up for Christian truth in the face of persecution. Excuse me. So there we have the principles of being Christ-like in ethics: sharing the mind of Christ, holding the commands of Christ, to love God and neighbor, having the character of Christ, excuse me, and finally being willing to carry the cross of Christ.